Chapter 1. A Boy from Small-Town America. Ronald Reagan was born on February 6, 1911, in Tampico, Illinois. Tampico was a very small town. It had just one main street, a few shops, and a grain elevator. Life in the town was simple, and most families didn't have much money. The Reagans were no different. Ronald's father, Jack, worked as a shoe salesman. His mother, Nell, stayed home to take care of Ronald and his older brother, Neil. The Reagan family struggled with money. Jack's job wasn't steady, and he often had to move the family from one small town to another. At times, they lived in rented houses that were cold and drafty. But despite these hardships, Nell taught her children to stay hopeful. She believed in kindness, faith, and hard work. These lessons stayed with Ronald his entire life. Ronald's father had a charming personality. He loved telling stories and making people laugh. But Jack had a problem. He drank too much. On some nights, he would come home drunk. Ronald would lie in bed, listening to his parents argue. He worried about his father. "Will Dad ever change?" he would ask himself. It was a painful part of his childhood, and he never forgot those difficult moments. To escape from these worries, Ronald found joy in books. He read anything he could find. Adventure stories, history books, and tales of brave heroes filled his imagination. His favorite stories were about pioneers and cowboys. He loved the idea of conquering the unknown, of facing danger with courage and determination. Sometimes he would pretend to be one of those heroes, acting out scenes in the backyard. His brother, Neil, would laugh and join in the fun. But books weren't the only thing that shaped young Ronald. He also loved sports. He played football and ran track in high school. He wasn't the biggest or strongest athlete, but he had heart. Coaches noticed his determination. Ronald never gave up, even when the odds were against him. In one football game, his team was losing badly. Ronald rallied his teammates with encouraging words. "We can still win. We just have to work together." Though they didn't win that day, his spirit left an impression on everyone. His talent for leadership didn't stop on the field. Ronald had a natural charm and a warm smile. People liked being around him. He was elected class president in high school and often gave speeches at school events. He had a talent for words. When he spoke, people listened. His voice was calm, steady, and full of conviction. Even as a teenager, Ronald understood the power of storytelling. However, life wasn't always easy in those years. The Great Depression began when Ronald was just a young man. Millions of people across America lost their jobs and homes. In Tampico and nearby towns, many families struggled to survive. Factories shut down, and farmers couldn't sell their crops. Ronald saw neighbors lose everything they owned. He watched as his father lost job after job. The future seemed uncertain. Yet, Ronald didn't let fear control him. He believed things would get better. His mother often said, "Everything happens for a reason. We just have to keep our faith." Ronald carried those words with him. He found ways to help others during tough times. He volunteered at local events, helped neighbors with chores, and encouraged his friends to stay positive. His optimism became one of his greatest strengths. One of the biggest moments of Ronald's teenage years happened at a church service. His mother was deeply involved in the church and often read passages from the Bible. One Sunday, Ronald was asked to recite a verse in front of the congregation. He was nervous. His hands shook and his mouth went dry. What if I forget the words? He worried. But when he stepped up to the podium and began speaking, something changed. His nerves disappeared. His voice grew strong and confident. Afterward, people praised him for his speech. Ronald learned that day that he had a gift, a voice that could inspire others. Ronald's love for helping people and telling stories made him dream of a brighter future. But at that time, he didn't know what that future would look like. Would he stay in a small town forever? Would he find a career he loved? He often wondered, what's out there beyond these small streets? The questions excited him and filled him with hope. As high school came to an end, Ronald faced an important decision. He knew his family didn't have the money to send him to a big university, but he refused to give up. He applied to Eureka College, a small school nearby, and was accepted. He earned a scholarship to help pay for his education. For the first time, Ronald felt his dreams were within reach. College was a new adventure. Ronald studied economics and sociology. He also joined the school's drama club and played sports. His days were busy, but he thrived. He discovered that he loved performing on stage. He wasn't just acting. He was connecting with people, making them feel something deep inside. It was a powerful experience, and it hinted at the path his life might take. During his college years, Ronald also became more involved in leadership. He was elected student body president and led protests against budget cuts at the school. His speeches inspired his classmates to stand together. He learned that leadership wasn't just about power. It was about service, about standing up for what was right. Graduating from Eureka College was a proud moment for Ronald. His parents were there to cheer him on. As he walked across the stage to receive his diploma, he thought about the journey ahead. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he had something more important: hope, courage, and the lessons of his childhood. Life had many surprises in store for him, and he was ready to face them all. This small-town boy, who had once dreamed of adventure, was about to embark on a remarkable journey. He didn't know it yet, but one day he would become one of the most famous leaders in the world. For now, though, he was just Ronald Reagan, a young man with big dreams and an even bigger heart. Chapter 2: College Dreams and the Radio Voice. Ronald Reagan arrived at Eureka College in the fall of 1928. The campus was small, but to him it felt full of possibility. The red brick buildings, the green lawns, and the buzzing classrooms gave him a sense of excitement. He was eager to learn and to make his mark. However, college wasn't going to be easy. Ronald knew his family couldn't help much with money. He would have to work hard to stay in school. Ronald had two goals when he started college. First, he wanted to succeed in his studies. Second, he dreamed of becoming a sports broadcaster. His love for sports had grown since childhood. He had spent many hours listening to games on the radio, imagining the crowd's roar and the athletes' movements. The voice of the radio announcer always captured his attention. "I can do that," Ronald often thought. But first, he had to prove himself. At Eureka, he studied sociology and economics. Classes were demanding, and balancing studies with campus activities wasn't easy. But Ronald was determined. He quickly became known for his involvement in clubs and sports. He joined the drama club and took part in plays where his smooth voice and confident presence stood out. He also played football and swam on the college team. His days were packed from morning to night, but he loved every moment. One of the most important lessons Ronald learned in college came during a student protest. The school administration wanted to cut some student programs to save money. Many students were upset, but few had the courage to speak up. Ronald, however, couldn't stay silent. He gave a speech on campus urging the school to reconsider its decision. His words were powerful. He spoke with passion, and the crowd listened. It was a moment of growth for him. He realized he had a gift for speaking to people, for inspiring them to take action. Despite his busy schedule, Ronald never forgot about his dream of becoming a broadcaster. During his free time, he practiced reading sports reports out loud. He would sit in his dorm room, pretending he was on the radio. "And here comes the pitch. It's a strike," he would say with excitement, as if thousands of people were listening. His roommate would laugh and say, "You sound like a real pro already." But for Ronald, this wasn't just practice. It was preparation for the future. In 1932, Ronald graduated from Eureka College. It was a proud day for him and his family. His mother and father sat in the audience, clapping as he walked across the stage to receive his diploma. He felt a mix of relief and excitement. He had made it through college, but now the real challenge lay ahead. What would come next? He wasn't sure, but he was ready to take a chance. After graduation, Ronald returned home to Illinois. The country was still struggling with the Great Depression. Jobs were scarce, and many young people couldn't find work. Ronald felt the weight of this uncertainty. He applied to several newspapers and radio stations, hoping someone would give him a break. But rejection letters came one after another. "Not enough experience," they said. Ronald began to doubt himself. Would his dream ever come true? One evening, he sat at the kitchen table with his mother. She noticed the worry on his face. "Don't give up, Ronnie," she said softly. "Sometimes the right opportunity comes when you least expect it." Her words gave him comfort. He promised himself he wouldn't quit. He would keep trying until someone gave him a chance. Then, one day, the phone rang. It was a small radio station in Davenport, Iowa, called WAC. They needed someone to announce sports games. Ronald's heart raced as he listened. He could hardly believe it. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for. He packed his bags and traveled to Davenport, ready to prove himself. At WOC, Ronald's job was to announce college football games. But there was a problem. He wasn't at the games. Instead, he sat in a small radio booth with only a telegraph machine in front of him. The machine typed out updates from the game. Ball on the 40-yard line. Pass incomplete. Touchdown. It was up to Ronald to take these dry updates and turn them into an exciting broadcast. He leaned into the microphone, his voice calm and smooth. The quarterback steps back. He throws. It's caught at the 20-yard line. The crowd is on its feet. Even though he couldn't see the game, he painted a picture with his words. Listeners felt as if they were right there in the stadium. His broadcasts became popular, and people started tuning in just to hear his voice. But there was one moment Ronald would never forget. During a broadcast, the telegraph machine suddenly stopped working. No updates were coming through. His heart pounded. What should he do? If he stayed silent, listeners would know something was wrong. So, he made a bold decision. He started making up the game. He described plays as if they were really happening. The running back breaks free. He's at the 10. The 5. Touchdown. When the telegraph finally started again, he adjusted the story to match the real score. No one knew the difference. The station manager heard about Ronald's quick thinking and was impressed. "That's what makes a good broadcaster," he said. "You stay calm under pressure." Ronald's reputation grew, and he was soon offered a job at a larger station in Des Moines, Iowa, WHO Radio. This was a major step forward in his career. At WHO, Ronald continued to broadcast sports, but he also interviewed players and covered local events. His confidence grew with each broadcast. He developed a signature style, friendly, engaging, and full of energy. People felt connected to him. They trusted his voice. One day, while walking to the station, Ronald paused to reflect. He had come a long way from the small dorm room at Eureka College where he had practiced announcing games. The dream that had once seemed distant was now a reality. But deep down, he knew this was just the beginning. There were more adventures ahead, more dreams to chase. As he put on his headphones and leaned into the microphone, he smiled. His future was beginning to shine, and he was ready for whatever came next. Chapter 3. The Hollywood Opportunity. In the spring of 1937, Ronald Reagan boarded a train headed for California. The train chugged along, passing fields, mountains, and small towns. Ronald looked out the window, his mind filled with thoughts of the unknown. He wasn't sure what to expect. He wasn't a famous man. He wasn't rich, but he carried something valuable: hope. California was a place where dreams came true. Could it be his turn? Ronald had never imagined becoming an actor. At that point, he was a successful sports broadcaster for WHO Radio in Iowa. His voice was loved by listeners, and his career seemed secure. But deep inside, Ronald longed for something bigger. He wanted adventure, excitement, a chance to do something different. So when the radio station sent him to cover the Chicago Cubs' spring training in California, he jumped at the opportunity. The sunny skies of California greeted him warmly. Palm trees lined the streets, and the smell of the ocean filled the air. The bustling city of Los Angeles seemed alive with possibility. Everything felt larger than life. Maybe something special will happen here, Ronald thought as he walked around the city. He had no idea just how right he was. During his trip, fate intervened. One day, while reporting on the baseball games, Ronald met a man who would change his life forever. This man was a talent scout for Warner Brothers Pictures. The scout had been watching Ronald. He liked the way Ronald spoke, confident, smooth, and full of charm. He asked Ronald if he had ever considered acting. Ronald laughed. "Acting? Me?" he said. But the scout wasn't joking. "You have the look and the voice," the man insisted. "Come to Warner Brothers for a screen test." Ronald felt a rush of excitement mixed with doubt. Could he really be an actor? He had never taken acting classes. He had no experience. But he was curious. Life had presented him with an unexpected door, and he decided to walk through it. The day of the screen test arrived. Ronald stood nervously in front of the cameras. Bright lights shone on his face. He delivered his lines as best as he could, hoping it was enough. The director watched closely, nodding occasionally. When it was over, Ronald exhaled and wiped his hands, which were damp with sweat. Did I do okay? He wondered. A few days later, he received the news. Warner Brothers was offering him a contract. It felt like a dream. In just a few days, his life had taken a new direction. He called his parents to share the news. "I'm going to be an actor," he told them. His mother cried with joy, and his father said, "I always knew you'd do something special." Ronald packed his things and moved to Hollywood. At first, it was overwhelming. The streets were filled with cars, lights, and people in expensive clothes. Movie posters decorated the city, showing glamorous stars like Clark Gable and Bette Davis. Ronald was just a beginner, but he was ready to learn. His first role came quickly. He appeared in the 1937 film Love is on the Air, playing a radio announcer. It was a small part, but it felt important to Ronald. He worked hard to understand the camera, the scripts, and the demands of movie making. He realized that acting was not just about saying lines, it was about emotion, connection, and timing. He wanted to improve, and so he studied other actors and asked for advice from directors. Warner Brothers kept him busy. Over the next few years, he acted in many films, often playing cheerful, likable characters. His smile and warm voice made him perfect for romantic comedies, westerns, and dramas. He wasn't the biggest star in Hollywood, but audiences enjoyed his performances. He brought a natural charm to the screen that made him relatable. One of his most memorable films was Knute Rockne, All-American, 1940, in which he played George Gipp, a dying football player who delivers the famous line, "Win one for the Gipper." The line became iconic, and so did Ronald's role. It wasn't the lead part, but it left an impression on audiences. Years later, people would still call him the Gipper, a nickname that stayed with him throughout his life. However, life in Hollywood wasn't always easy. As he gained more success, Ronald faced new pressures. Studios controlled much of his life, from the roles he played to the public image he had to maintain. He had to smile for cameras at glamorous events, even when he felt exhausted. Is this what I really want? He sometimes asked himself late at night. During World War II, Ronald's life took another turn. The war had begun, and many actors were called to serve. In 1942, Ronald enlisted in the Army Air Forces. He didn't go to the front lines, but he used his talents in a different way. He worked on training films that helped soldiers prepare for battle. The films were serious and important. Ronald felt proud to contribute to the war effort. He realized that being an actor wasn't just about entertainment. It could also be about service. After the war, Ronald returned to Hollywood, but things had changed. The studio system wasn't as powerful, and his career slowed down. He acted in fewer films and began to think about what else he could do. He was curious about politics and world events. He often read books and debated ideas with friends. There's more to life than Hollywood, he thought. In the early 1950s, Ronald shifted to television. He hosted the popular show General Electric Theater, which aired every Sunday. The show brought him into millions of living rooms across America. People felt like they knew him personally, like he was a friend they could trust. This connection would prove important in the future. As Ronald's time in Hollywood continued, he started giving speeches at events. His speeches weren't just about movies. They were about America, freedom, and the values he believed in. People admired his ability to speak with passion and clarity. Slowly, without realizing it, Ronald was preparing for the next chapter of his life. By the mid-1950s, Ronald Reagan had acted in over 50 films. He wasn't the biggest star in Hollywood, but he had made a name for himself. He had also grown as a person. The boy who once dreamed of announcing sports games had become a man with a larger vision. He was curious about the world, and he wanted to make a difference. As he stood on a movie set one afternoon, looking out at the bright California sun, he thought about everything he had experienced. This isn't the end, he told himself. It's just the beginning. And he was right. Chapter 4: A Patriot in Wartime. In 1941, the world was at war. Europe was in chaos. Countries were fighting for their survival. The skies filled with planes, the seas with ships, and the ground with soldiers. America had not joined the war yet, but everything was about to change. On December 7th, 1941, Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor. Thousands of Americans were killed or wounded. The news spread quickly across the nation. People listened to their radios in shock. President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared, "This is a day that will live in infamy." The United States was now at war. Ronald Reagan heard the news while working in Hollywood. He had a successful acting career, but the attack on Pearl Harbor made him think differently. Like many Americans, he felt a deep sense of duty. His country needed him. He couldn't stand by while others went off to fight. "I want to do my part," he told a friend. In 1942, Ronald enlisted in the U.S. Army. He was ready to serve, but there was a problem: his eyesight. He had poor vision and couldn't pass the medical tests required for combat duty. The Army decided he was unfit to fight on the front lines. At first, he was disappointed. He had imagined himself wearing a helmet, carrying a rifle, and fighting for freedom. But life had other plans for him. Instead of combat, Ronald was assigned to the 1st Motion Picture Unit, a division of the Army Air Forces. At first, he wasn't sure what to think. Was making movies really important in a time of war? Would he be helping soldiers, or just acting in front of a camera? These questions filled his mind as he arrived at the unit's headquarters, a converted movie studio in Culver City, California. When he walked through the gates, he realized this was no ordinary movie set. The 1st Motion Picture Unit was filled with military personnel who had experience in film production. Directors, screenwriters, actors, and technicians, all of them had come together to create something special. Their mission was simple but important: make films that would train, educate, and inspire soldiers. Ronald's first project was to act in a training film about aircraft safety. The film showed pilots how to take care of their planes and avoid dangerous mistakes. The work was serious. These films could mean the difference between life and death. As Ronald watched the final cut, he realized how valuable his role was. His voice and presence were helping soldiers prepare for battle. It wasn't what he had expected, but it mattered. Over time, Ronald became more involved in the production process. He helped write scripts, directed scenes, and worked with other actors. He learned how to create powerful messages that could motivate and inform. One film he worked on explained how to spot enemy planes. Another showed soldiers how to survive in harsh conditions. These films weren't shown in movie theaters. They were sent directly to military bases around the world. Ronald found joy and purpose in his work. But the war wasn't just something he saw on film. News of battles and bombings arrived daily. He heard stories of soldiers who had lost their lives and families waiting anxiously for loved ones to return home. One night, he received a letter from a friend who was fighting overseas. The letter described the fear and loneliness that soldiers felt in the trenches. Ronald read it slowly, his hands shaking. He wished he could do more. "I can't be there with them," he thought, "but I can help in my own way." One of the most challenging projects he worked on was a film about the importance of mental strength. War wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Soldiers needed to stay brave even when fear tried to break them. The film showed how to cope with stress, stay focused, and never give up. Ronald believed in this message. He knew that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the ability to keep going despite it. In 1943, the first motion picture unit released a film called Recognition of the Japanese Zero Fighter Plane. It was a major success. The film trained pilots to identify enemy aircraft in the sky. If they could spot a Japanese Zero quickly, they had a better chance of surviving an attack. Ronald played a key role in the film's development, and the positive feedback gave him pride. "We're making a difference," he thought. During the war, Ronald met many men and women who shared their stories with him. One soldier described how his unit had been saved after watching a training film. Another thanked Ronald personally for making complex instructions easy to understand. These encounters reminded him that every contribution, no matter how small, could help win the war. But the war also brought heartbreak. Ronald received news that some of his friends from Hollywood had died in combat. He thought of their laughter, their dreams, and the futures they would never have. He felt the weight of their sacrifice. It made him appreciate life even more. He also knew that freedom wasn't free. It required bravery, sacrifice, and leadership. By 1945, the war was coming to an end. Victory was within reach, but the cost had been high. Millions of lives had been lost. Ronald reflected on what he had learned during those years. The war had shown him that leadership wasn't about fame or power. It was about serving others, making hard decisions, and standing up for what was right. When the war finally ended, Ronald returned to Hollywood. But he wasn't the same person. The experiences of those years had changed him. He had seen how fragile peace could be. He had witnessed the power of teamwork and the importance of standing together. He carried these lessons with him for the rest of his life. As he packed up his uniform and stored it away, he thought about the soldiers he had met, the stories he had heard, and the work they had accomplished. "We did our part," he said quietly to himself. "Now, it's time to build a better future." Little did he know, his ideas about leadership, service, and freedom would guide him toward a new path, one that would take him to the highest office in the country. Chapter 5. From Actor to Leader. The 1950s were a time of change for Ronald Reagan. His acting career, once filled with big opportunities, had slowed down. He was no longer landing major film roles. Instead, he found work on television. He became the host of General Electric Theater, a popular program watched by millions of Americans every week. But this job wasn't just about entertainment. It was also about something much bigger, connecting with people. As part of his contract with General Electric, GE, Ronald traveled across the country. He visited GE factories, met workers, and gave speeches. At first, the speeches were simple. He talked about the show and shared stories from his time in Hollywood. But as he visited more places, he started to notice something. Workers wanted to talk about more than movies. They had concerns about their jobs, the economy, and the future of America. Ronald listened carefully, and these conversations changed him. In the factory break rooms and lunch halls, he heard about rising taxes, government regulations, and fears of losing freedom. Some workers felt that the government was becoming too powerful. Others worried that America was losing its values. These conversations made Ronald think about the direction the country was heading. He began to study politics, read history books, and explore different ideas. Slowly, his speeches shifted from entertainment to issues that mattered to ordinary people. One night, after giving a speech, a worker came up to him and said, "You should be in politics. We need someone like you." Ronald laughed, but the words stayed with him. He had never considered a political career before. But now, the idea seemed possible. He loved speaking to crowds, and he was good at it. More importantly, he believed he had something to say. At the time, Ronald was a member of the Democratic Party. He supported liberal causes and admired President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who had led the country during the Great Depression and World War II. But as the years passed, Ronald's political views began to change. He felt the government had grown too large and was interfering too much in people's lives. He believed that individuals, not the government, should have the freedom to make their own decisions. His ideas were becoming more conservative. This shift in his beliefs was gradual, but powerful. He often talked with friends about political issues, debating ideas late into the night. He questioned the role of government, the economy, and the importance of national defense. By the early 1960s, he had become a Republican. His decision surprised some of his friends, but Ronald felt he was following his heart. "I didn't leave the Democratic Party," he said once. "The party left me." In 1964, Ronald had his first major moment in politics. That year, Republican presidential candidate Barry Goldwater was running against President Lyndon B. Johnson. Goldwater's campaign needed a strong speaker to promote conservative ideas. Ronald was asked to give a televised speech in support of Goldwater. It was a risky decision. If the speech failed, it could damage his reputation. But Ronald believed in the message and agreed to do it. The speech, titled "A Time for Choosing," aired on October 27, 1964. Ronald stood on stage, dressed in a dark suit, his voice steady and clear. He spoke about freedom, personal responsibility, and the dangers of too much government control. His words were powerful. "You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We can preserve for our children this last best hope of man on earth, or we can sentence them to take the first step into 1,000 years of darkness." The speech captivated millions of viewers. People who had never heard of Ronald Reagan suddenly saw him as a leader. His delivery was calm but passionate. He didn't just recite facts. He told a story about America's future. By the end of the broadcast, donations for Goldwater's campaign had poured in. Although Goldwater lost the election, Ronald's speech was a success. Newspapers called him the new voice of conservatism. His phone started ringing with calls from political leaders, asking if he would consider running for office. At home, Ronald talked with his wife, Nancy, about the possibility of entering politics. Nancy had always been his biggest supporter. She believed in his abilities and knew he could make a difference. But politics would bring challenges. Their family life would change. There would be long hours, public criticism, and little privacy. "Are you ready for that?" Nancy asked. Ronald thought for a moment and smiled. "If I can make a difference, it's worth it." In 1965, Ronald announced he was running for governor of California. Many people were surprised. Could a former actor really lead the state? His opponents mocked him, calling him a Hollywood cowboy. But Ronald didn't let the criticism shake him. He traveled across California, giving speeches, meeting farmers, factory workers, teachers, and business owners. He talked about cutting taxes, reducing government waste, and restoring law and order. His campaign wasn't flashy. He didn't have the support of major political figures at first. But he had something more important. People believed in him. Crowds grew larger at every rally. His speeches were filled with optimism. He made voters feel like they could be part of something important. "I'm not a politician," he often said. "I'm just a citizen who wants to help." As Election Day approached, the excitement grew. Newspapers started to take him seriously. Polls showed he was gaining ground. His message was clear, and his personality won over doubters. He wasn't just an actor anymore. He was a leader with a vision. On November 8th, 1966, the votes were counted. Ronald Reagan had won the election, becoming the 33rd governor of California. His victory was a moment of pride, but it was also the start of a new challenge. The problems he had talked about during the campaign wouldn't be easy to fix. There were protests, budget issues, and debates over education and public safety. But Ronald wasn't afraid. He knew leadership meant making tough decisions. As he stood on the steps of the California Capitol, giving his inaugural speech, he looked out at the crowd. He saw faces filled with hope, expectation, and trust. This is just the beginning, he thought. He had entered politics to make a difference, and he wasn't going to stop now. Behind the scenes, he was already thinking about the future. California was just one step. Could he take his message to the entire nation? Could he lead America as he had led his state? These questions filled his mind. He didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was clear. He had found his calling. Ronald Reagan, the actor turned governor, was ready for the next chapter of his life. Chapter 6. The Governor of California. In 1966, California was facing many challenges. The state was growing quickly, but its problems were growing even faster. Taxes were high. The budget was a mess. Universities were filled with student protests. Some neighborhoods faced crime, and people were worried about the future. They wanted a leader who could solve these problems and give them hope. They wanted someone who could bring change. That someone would be Ronald Reagan. At the time, Ronald was not a career politician. He had spent most of his life in Hollywood, acting in movies and television shows. But something about him felt different. He wasn't a typical candidate. He had a warm, friendly voice, a confident smile, and a message that people believed in. When he announced he was running for governor of California, many people laughed. An actor running for governor, his critics said. But Ronald didn't let the criticism bother him. He traveled across the state, meeting people in small towns, cities, and rural areas. He visited farms, factories, and schools. He shook hands with farmers, teachers, and business owners. He listened to their concerns. He didn't just make promises, he offered solutions. His message was clear: lower taxes, less government control, and more freedom for individuals. People liked what they heard. His optimism reminded them of a better future. His speeches were filled with phrases that gave people hope. Government should serve the people, not control them, he often said. Crowds cheered. His words were simple but powerful. He talked about hard work, responsibility, and the American dream. He made people feel that they could be part of something important. Slowly, he gained more and more support. But the campaign wasn't easy. His opponent, Edmund Pat Brown, had been governor for 8 years and was an experienced politician. Brown was confident that he would win again. He called Ronald a Hollywood amateur who didn't understand the complexities of politics. But Ronald was prepared. He knew how to handle pressure. Years of acting in front of cameras had taught him how to stay calm under fire. During a televised debate, Brown attacked Ronald's lack of political experience. Ronald smiled and responded calmly. "I know how to solve problems. The people of California don't need another politician. They need someone who can lead." His response earned applause from viewers at home. People liked that Ronald wasn't afraid to be himself. He didn't pretend to be a typical politician, and that's exactly what many voters wanted. As Election Day approached, tensions rose. Would the people of California choose a new direction, or would they stick with the same leadership? The polls showed a close race, but Ronald remained confident. "I trust the people," he said. "They know what's best for their future." On November 8th, 1966, the votes were counted. Ronald Reagan won by a landslide, with over 1 million more votes than his opponent. It was a clear message. Californians wanted change, and they believed Ronald could deliver it. The victory was a turning point in his life. He had gone from actor to political leader, but winning the election was just the beginning. The real work was about to start. Ronald took office in January 1967. The day was cold, but filled with excitement. As he stood on the steps of the California State Capitol in Sacramento, he looked out at the crowd. Thousands of people had come to see their new governor. "I will work hard to make this state better," he promised. "Together, we can solve our problems." But governing a state as large as California wasn't easy. Ronald quickly realized that fixing problems required tough decisions. One of his first challenges was balancing the state budget. California was spending more money than it was earning. Ronald believed the solution was simple: cut spending and lower taxes. But it wasn't that easy. Many people opposed his plan, arguing that cutting programs would hurt education and social services. The debates were intense. Lawmakers argued back and forth, and protests filled the streets. Some groups accused Ronald of being too harsh. "You're taking away funding for important programs," they said. But Ronald stood firm. He believed that reducing government spending would help the economy in the long run. "We can't spend money we don't have," he explained. "We must live within our means." After months of negotiation, Ronald succeeded in passing budget reforms. The changes weren't perfect, and some people were unhappy. But the state's financial situation improved. Businesses grew, and more jobs were created. Slowly, the economy started to recover. Ronald's ability to stick to his principles earned him respect, even from those who had doubted him. Another major issue during his time as governor was the wave of student protests. Across the country, young people were protesting the Vietnam War, racial inequality, and other social issues. California's universities became hot spots for demonstrations. At the University of California, Berkeley, students held sit-ins and rallies, demanding change. Ronald believed in free speech, but he also believed in law and order. He thought protests should be peaceful and not disrupt public life. When some protests turned violent, he took a strong stance. He sent in the National Guard to restore order. His actions were controversial. Some praised him for keeping the peace, while others accused him of being too strict. But Ronald believed he was doing what was necessary to protect the public. Despite the challenges, Ronald continued to lead with optimism. He believed that California could be a model for the rest of the country. He focused on improving education, building infrastructure, and creating new opportunities for businesses. He often said, "If we work together, there's nothing we can't achieve." One of his proudest accomplishments as governor was reforming California's welfare system. He believed that welfare should help people get back on their feet, not keep them dependent on government aid. He introduced policies that encouraged people to find jobs and become self-sufficient. His reforms were successful, and other states later adopted similar policies. By the end of his first term, Ronald had proven that he wasn't just an actor playing a role. He was a real leader who could make difficult decisions. In 1970, he ran for re-election and won again. But by this time, his thoughts had begun to shift. California was important, but he started to wonder if he could do more. Could he take what he had learned as governor and apply it to the entire nation? As his second term came to an end, Ronald began considering a run for the presidency. He hadn't made a final decision yet, but the idea excited him. America is facing challenges, just like California did, he thought. Maybe I can help. On his last day as governor, Ronald looked out the window of his office and reflected on the journey. He had come a long way since his days in Hollywood, but this wasn't the end of his story. It was only the beginning of something much bigger. Chapter 7. The Road to the Presidency. By the late 1970s, Ronald Reagan was thinking about his next big step. He had served 2 terms as governor of California, but he wasn't ready to retire. He believed he could do more for the country. The United States was facing serious problems. Inflation was high, unemployment was rising, and energy shortages left many gas stations empty. People were frustrated and worried about the future. Ronald thought he had a solution. He believed in America's strength, its people, and its ability to overcome any challenge. But first, he had to convince the nation. Ronald had tried to run for president once before, in 1976. He had challenged President Gerald Ford for the Republican nomination, but lost. It was a hard defeat. He had been so close, yet victory slipped away. Many people thought his political career was over, but not Ronald. "I learned from that experience," he said. "Next time, I'll be ready." That next time came in 1980. Ronald was 69 years old, but he was energetic, determined, and full of ideas. His supporters believed he had what it took to win. The first step was to secure the Republican nomination. His main opponent was George H.W. Bush, a younger and more experienced politician. Bush criticized Ronald's economic ideas, calling them voodoo economics, because he believed they wouldn't work. But Ronald stayed calm and focused. He knew his message resonated with the American people. During the Republican debates, Ronald's charm and confidence shone through. In one debate, the moderator tried to cut off his microphone. Ronald smiled and said firmly, "I am paying for this microphone, Mr. Green." The audience erupted in applause. That moment showed his strength and independence. It became one of the defining events of the campaign. After months of hard work, Ronald won the Republican nomination. But the battle wasn't over. Now, he had to face the current president, Jimmy Carter, in the general election. Carter was struggling to solve the country's problems, but he still had the power of the presidency behind him. Many believed the race would be close. The campaign trail was long and exhausting. Ronald traveled across the country, giving speeches, shaking hands, and meeting voters. He talked about reducing taxes, cutting government spending, and making America strong again. His most famous line was, "Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago?" This question hit home for many voters. They thought about rising prices, long gas lines, and lost jobs. For them, the answer was clear. They wanted change. Ronald's optimism was contagious. He often used simple, powerful phrases that people could remember. One of his most famous messages was, "It's morning again in America." He described a future where people could dream big, work hard, and succeed. To him, America wasn't in decline. It was just waiting for the right leader to bring back its greatness. People loved that message. It gave them hope. But the campaign wasn't without challenges. Critics said Ronald was too conservative, too old, and too inexperienced in foreign policy. He faced tough questions about how he would deal with the Soviet Union and the ongoing Cold War. But Ronald had a simple response: peace through strength. He believed that America needed a strong military to protect itself and to negotiate from a position of power. His message was clear. If America was strong, peace would follow. As the election approached, polls showed a close race. Both candidates gave their final speeches, hoping to win over undecided voters. On election night, the country waited anxiously for the results. News anchors reported the numbers as they came in. Slowly, it became clear that Ronald was ahead. State after state turned in his favor. By the end of the night, he had won in a landslide, with 489 electoral votes to Carter's 49. It was a decisive victory. Ronald Reagan was the new President of the United States. That night, as Ronald stood in front of a cheering crowd, he felt a wave of emotion. He had dreamed of this moment for years. He had worked hard, faced defeat, and never given up. Now, he was ready to lead the nation. But he also understood the weight of his responsibility. This is not just about me, he thought. It's about the people who believed in me. I can't let them down. The inauguration took place on January 20th, 1981. It was a cold but beautiful day in Washington, D.C. Thousands of people gathered on the National Mall to witness history. Ronald stood on the steps of the Capitol, placing his hand on the Bible as he took the oath of office. His voice was steady, filled with confidence. "So help me God," he said, marking the beginning of his presidency. In his inaugural address, Ronald spoke about the challenges ahead, but also about the strength of the American spirit. "Government is not the solution to our problem," he said. "Government is the problem." His words echoed his belief that the American people, not politicians, would drive the country forward. That same day, something extraordinary happened. 52 American hostages who had been held in Iran for over a year were released. The country celebrated their return. Some believed the timing was symbolic. Hope was returning to America, and a new chapter had begun. But the road ahead would not be easy. Ronald knew he had to act quickly to address the nation's economic problems. Inflation was at 13%, and interest rates were sky high. Unemployment was rising, and businesses were struggling. He introduced a plan to cut taxes, reduce government spending, and encourage businesses to grow. His plan, known as Reaganomics, was controversial. Supporters said it would boost the economy, but critics warned it would lead to higher deficits. Despite the debates, Ronald remained optimistic. He believed that if people were given more freedom to spend and invest their money, the economy would recover. "I trust the American people," he said. "They know how to create prosperity." His first few months in office were filled with important decisions. He met with world leaders, signed executive orders, and worked with Congress to pass new laws. He faced opposition from lawmakers and protests from citizens who disagreed with his policies. But Ronald stayed true to his vision. He had learned from his years in California that leadership wasn't about pleasing everyone. It was about doing what he believed was right. In private moments, he often talked with his wife, Nancy. she was his closest advisor and strongest supporter. "We've come a long way," he would say to her. Nancy smiled and replied, "And we're just getting started." Ronald Reagan's journey to the presidency had been long and full of challenges. But through it all, he had remained hopeful, determined, and committed to his beliefs. He had proven that dreams don't die, even when obstacles seem too great. As he settled into his new role, he knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready. It was morning again in America, and Ronald Reagan was prepared to lead the way. Chapter 8: The Cold War Heats Up. When Ronald Reagan became president in 1981, the world was divided. Two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, were in a long, tense conflict known as the Cold War. It wasn't a traditional war with soldiers and battles. It was a fight for power, influence, and ideas. The United States supported democracy and capitalism, while the Soviet Union promoted communism and state control. For decades, both sides had built massive arsenals of nuclear weapons. The threat of global destruction loomed over the world like a dark cloud. Reagan believed that the Cold War wasn't just about politics. It was about freedom. He saw the Soviet Union as a threat to liberty. "They want to spread their system of control to other countries," he warned. "We have to stop them." But Reagan also knew that winning this conflict wouldn't be easy. The Soviet Union was powerful, and tensions were high. In 1983, Reagan gave a speech that made headlines around the world. He called the Soviet Union an evil empire. The words were bold and shocking. Some people thought they were too harsh, but Reagan believed in speaking the truth. "I'm not afraid to call things what they are," he said. His goal wasn't to start a war. His goal was to push the Soviet Union toward change. Reagan's strategy for dealing with the Soviet Union was simple: peace through strength. He believed that America needed a strong military to protect itself and to negotiate with the Soviets from a position of power. "If we are weak, they won't respect us," he explained. "But if we are strong, we can talk about peace." One of Reagan's first steps was to increase defense spending. He invested billions of dollars in new weapons, ships, planes, and missile systems. He also announced the development of a new defense project called the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, which became known as Star Wars. The idea was to build a system that could shoot down incoming missiles from space. It sounded like science fiction, but Reagan believed in the power of technology. "If we can protect our country without having to use our own nuclear weapons, we can make the world safer," he said. The announcement of SDI worried the Soviet Union. Their economy was struggling, and they couldn't afford to keep up with America's military spending. Soviet leaders accused Reagan of creating an arms race, but behind closed doors, they knew they had a problem. They couldn't compete for long. Meanwhile, Reagan worked to strengthen America's alliances with other countries. He built close relationships with British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and Pope John Paul II. They shared his belief that the Soviet system was failing and needed to be challenged. Together, they pressured the Soviet Union to allow more freedom and reduce its control over Eastern Europe. But Reagan didn't just rely on military power. He also believed in the power of words and ideas. He often spoke about the importance of human rights. He criticized the Soviet government for its treatment of its people, especially those who wanted to leave the country or speak out against the system. In his speeches, he reminded the world that freedom was worth fighting for. One of Reagan's most famous speeches came in 1987 when he visited Berlin, Germany. At that time, the city was divided by the Berlin Wall. The wall was a symbol of the divide between the free world and communist control. Standing near the wall, Reagan delivered a powerful message to Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." His words echoed around the world. They were bold, direct, and full of hope. Gorbachev had become the leader of the Soviet Union in 1985. Unlike his predecessors, Gorbachev understood that the Soviet system was in trouble. The economy was weak, and the people were unhappy. He introduced reforms like perestroika, economic restructuring, and glasnost, openness and transparency. Reagan saw an opportunity. He believed Gorbachev was someone he could work with. The two leaders met several times to discuss arms control and ways to reduce the threat of nuclear war. Their meetings weren't always smooth. There were disagreements and tense moments, but over time, they built a relationship based on mutual respect. Reagan admired Gorbachev's willingness to change, and Gorbachev respected Reagan's strength and determination. In 1987, the two leaders signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces (INF) Treaty. It was the first treaty to reduce the number of nuclear weapons, rather than just limit them. The world breathed a sigh of relief. It was a major step toward peace, and both leaders were praised for their efforts. Reagan's strategy of peace through strength was working. But the Cold War wasn't over yet. In Eastern Europe, people were beginning to demand freedom. Protests erupted in countries like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. Reagan supported these movements by speaking out against oppression and offering support to dissidents. "The people of these nations have a right to be free," he said. "We will stand with them." Slowly, the Soviet Union's grip on its satellite states began to weaken. By 1989, the pressure was too great to ignore. That year, the Berlin Wall fell, and the people of East and West Berlin celebrated together. The world watched as families reunited, friends embraced, and citizens tore down the wall with their bare hands. It was a powerful moment, and it marked the beginning of the end of the Cold War. Reagan wasn't president when the wall came down, but his role in the events leading up to it was undeniable. His leadership, his speeches, and his determination had helped bring about change. He had shown that peace didn't have to come from surrender or fear. It could come from strength and resolve. Looking back on his time as president, Reagan was proud of what he had accomplished. "We stood up for freedom," he said, "and freedom won." He believed that his greatest achievement was helping to create a safer, freer world for future generations. But Reagan also knew that the Cold War wasn't just about politics or military power. It was about people, those who had lived under oppression, and those who had fought for change. "The lesson of the Cold War," he said, "is that the human spirit cannot be crushed. No wall is strong enough to keep people from dreaming of freedom." Chapter 9. Economic Reforms and Tough Decisions. When Ronald Reagan became president in 1981, the American economy was in trouble. Inflation was high, prices kept rising, and people struggled to buy everyday goods. Gasoline, food, and rent were more expensive than ever. Interest rates were sky high, making it difficult for businesses to borrow money. Unemployment was rising, and millions of Americans were out of work. The country was stuck, and many wondered, how can we fix this? Reagan had a plan. He believed that America's economic problems were caused by high taxes and too much government interference. His solution was simple: lower taxes, reduce regulations, and allow businesses to grow. He believed that if businesses succeeded, they would create more jobs, and the entire country would benefit. His plan became known as Reaganomics. One of the key parts of his plan was cutting income taxes. Reagan believed that if people and businesses had more money, they would spend and invest it, which would boost the economy. In 1981, he worked with Congress to pass the Economic Recovery Tax Act. It was one of the largest tax cuts in U.S. history. For many Americans, this meant they could keep more of their paychecks. Some people cheered. Business owners believed they could finally expand their companies, hire more workers, and invest in new projects. Middle-class families welcomed the extra money, which helped them pay bills and save for the future. Reagan often said, "A rising tide lifts all boats," meaning that if the economy grew, everyone would benefit. But not everyone agreed. Critics said that Reagan's tax cuts mostly helped the wealthy and big corporations. They argued that the rich were getting richer while the poor struggled to get by. Some worried that the government was losing too much money from taxes, which would lead to higher deficits and debt. How will we pay for schools, roads, and public services? They asked. Despite the criticism, Reagan remained confident. He believed that the benefits would come, but it would take time. "We need to be patient," he told the American people. "Growth doesn't happen overnight." He compared the economy to a garden. "We've planted the seeds," he said. "Now we have to wait for them to grow." As the tax cuts took effect, Reagan also focused on reducing government spending. He believed that the government had become too big and was wasting money. He cut funding for some programs, including welfare and food assistance. His goal was to encourage people to become independent and find work. "We should help people help themselves," he said. "That's how we create lasting change." But cutting programs wasn't easy. Many people depended on government assistance to survive. Some protested, holding signs that read, "We need help." Reagan understood their frustration, but believed his plan would create a stronger economy in the long run. "We can't solve poverty by making people dependent on the government," he explained. "We need to give them opportunities to succeed." One of the biggest challenges Reagan faced was balancing the budget. The tax cuts reduced the government's income, but military spending increased. Reagan believed that a strong defense was necessary to protect the country and win the Cold War. He spent billions of dollars on new weapons, ships, and planes. As a result, the national debt grew rapidly. Economists warned that the country was borrowing too much money. Reagan acknowledged the problem, but argued that peace and security were worth the cost. During his first few years in office, the economy remained weak. Unemployment rose, and some Americans lost hope. "Is Reagan's plan working?" the newspapers asked. Even some of his supporters began to doubt him. But Reagan didn't back down. He continued to give speeches, reassuring the nation that better days were ahead. "Stay the course," he urged. "We are moving in the right direction." Then, in 1983, something changed. The economy began to recover. Businesses started hiring again, and unemployment dropped. Inflation, which had been a major problem, slowed down. The stock market soared, and people felt more confident about their future. Reagan's gamble seemed to be paying off. One of the happiest moments for Reagan came when he visited a small factory in Ohio. The owner had expanded his business and hired dozens of new workers. As Reagan toured the factory, workers shook his hand and thanked him. "I was out of work for 2 years," one man said. "Now I have a job again. Thank you, Mr. President." Reagan smiled, feeling proud that his policies were making a difference in people's lives. But not everyone shared that optimism. Some communities, especially in poor urban areas, continued to struggle. Factories closed, and jobs moved to other cities or countries. The gap between the rich and the poor widened. Homelessness increased, and many families couldn't afford housing. Reagan's critics blamed his policies for ignoring the most vulnerable. "What about the people who are left behind?" they asked. Reagan acknowledged these concerns, but believed the best solution was to create more jobs, not more government programs. "We can't solve every problem overnight," he said, "but if the economy keeps growing, we can lift everyone up." One of Reagan's biggest challenges came in 1985, when Congress pressured him to raise taxes to reduce the national deficit. Reagan didn't like the idea, but he agreed to compromise. He signed a tax reform bill that simplified the tax code and closed loopholes. It was a difficult decision, but Reagan believed it was necessary to protect the country's financial future. Throughout his presidency, Reagan often spoke about the importance of hard work, perseverance, and believing in the American dream. He loved telling stories about ordinary people who had overcome obstacles. One of his favorite stories was about a small business owner who had almost lost everything but managed to rebuild his company. "That's the spirit of America," Reagan said. "We never give up." As Reagan's second term came to an end, the economy was stronger than when he first took office. Unemployment was low, inflation was under control, and businesses were thriving. But the national debt remained a concern, and debates about the fairness of Reagan's policies continued. Some viewed him as a hero who revived the economy, while others saw him as a leader who favored the wealthy. Reagan, however, remained optimistic. "We have accomplished a lot," he said in his farewell address, "but the work is never done. The future is bright, and the best is yet to come." Looking back, Reagan believed that his economic policies had helped restore confidence in the country. "America is once again a shining city on a hill," he said. "Our job is to keep the light shining for future generations." His legacy in economics remains a topic of debate, but one thing is certain. Ronald Reagan changed the way America thought about taxes, government, and growth. His leadership inspired millions, and his belief in the power of the people left a lasting impact. Chapter 10. The Challenger Tragedy. On January 28, 1986, millions of Americans gathered around their televisions to watch a special event. The Challenger space shuttle was preparing for takeoff. It wasn't just another mission. This time, a civilian, a school teacher named Krista McAuliffe, was on board. She had trained for months and was ready to become the first teacher in space. Students across the country watched eagerly, hoping to learn from her journey. The air was filled with excitement. At Cape Canaveral, Florida, the countdown began. The crew of 7 astronauts sat in their seats, wearing their spacesuits. They were ready. The engines roared, and the shuttle lifted off the ground. Flames and smoke trailed behind it as it soared into the blue sky. People cheered and waved American flags. It was a proud moment for the nation. But something went terribly wrong. Just 73 seconds after liftoff, the Challenger exploded. A fireball erupted in the sky, and pieces of the shuttle fell toward the ocean. On live television, viewers watched in horror. At first, there was confusion. "Is this part of the launch?" some asked. But soon, it became clear that this was no ordinary event. The shuttle had been destroyed, and there were no survivors. Silence fell over classrooms, living rooms, and offices. Children who had been cheering minutes earlier were now crying. Parents and teachers struggled to explain what had happened. The nation was in shock. The space program, a symbol of progress and exploration, had suffered a devastating loss. At the White House, President Ronald Reagan received the news. His heart sank. He had been scheduled to deliver the State of the Union address that evening, but he immediately canceled it. Instead, he knew he had a different duty: to speak directly to the American people and comfort them. "This is a tragedy that affects all of us," he said to his advisors. "We need to help the nation heal." Reagan spent the next few hours preparing his speech. He wanted his words to be simple, honest, and full of compassion. He understood the pain that families, friends, and citizens were feeling. He also knew that this moment would be remembered for years to come. That evening, Reagan sat behind his desk in the Oval Office. The room was quiet, and the lights were dimmed. Cameras were set up, ready to broadcast his message to the world. His face was serious, but his eyes showed warmth and understanding. He began speaking in a calm, steady voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, today is a day for mourning and remembering. Nancy and I are pained to the core by the tragedy of the Challenger. We know we share this pain with all of the people of our country. This is truly a national loss." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. He knew millions of people were listening, searching for comfort. "We've grown used to the idea of space, and perhaps we forget that it's still dangerous. The brave crew of the Challenger knew the risks, but they chose to accept them because they believed in exploration and discovery. They wanted to push the boundaries of what is possible." Reagan spoke directly to the families of the astronauts. His voice softened, filled with empathy. "To the families of the Challenger crew, we cannot bear, as you do, the full impact of this tragedy. But we feel the loss, and we're thinking about you so very much. Your loved ones were pioneers." He continued, addressing the children who had watched the launch from their classrooms. "I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things happen when we reach for great heights. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted, it belongs to the brave." Reagan's words reminded the nation that the astronauts had died doing something extraordinary. They were heroes who had taken a bold step for the future.